This is a faux flat fell seam, and a flat fell seam is what you would see on the crotch seam of a pair of jeans. So the first step is to cut one of your squares in half, and then with the wrong sides, or the technical backs, together, this is unlike what we usually do, you're going to pin the edges so that they are flush with one another. And I just like to put 3 pins in, one at the top, middle, and bottom, if you're just doing a small sample. Next, you're going to head over to your sewing machine, and you are going to use 1/2 inch of seam allowance. So make sure that you're lining up the edge of your fabric with 1/2 inch. If it helps you to use a chalk and ruler to mark that, you may do that as well. Begin your sample with a back stitch, and then straight stitch all the way to the end, ending with the back stitch. So all we're doing right now is putting 2 pieces of fabric together and stitching them together with the wrong sides facing one another. After you've clipped your threads, you'll head back over to the iron for some pressing. First, I like to press the sample flat, and then I'm going to be pressing on the right side, or the technical face of the fabric, and I like to kind of try to pull the 2 pieces away from one another. So when you flip this over, you're going to be able to see when there's a little bit of a tuck. So you see how there's a little bit of a tuck that was pressed there? I want to really pull those 2 pieces of fabric apart so that the seam is very flat and there aren't any tucks whatsoever. And this is good practice for all of your sewing to make sure that you're pressing on both sides. Next, I'm going to be trimming down one of the sides of fabric to 1/4 inch. So I'm going to use a ruler and a sharp piece of chalk to mark 1/4 inch away from the stitch line onto the seam allowance. And then I'm going to be carefully cutting away that excess seam allowance, but only on one of the sides. Make sure that you are not cutting through both the layers, but you are only cutting through one layer of fabric. And I like to cut on the left edge of the chalk to make sure that I am truly cutting off 1/4 inch rather than 3/8 inch. Again, make sure that you're only cutting one layer of fabric. And the way that we do this faux way, is because the actual flat fell seam is easier to do with some glue and a special flat fell machine. And so this is a way that we can kind of replicate what that seam looks like, even though it's not exactly the same. Next, you're going to mark 1/4 inch on the other side of your fabric, the one that has a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then you are going to carefully start folding that under, and you'll also have a little bit of resistance from the seam allowance that's under it, that's at 1/4 inch. And you're going to start pinning vertical pins up the length of the fabric so that this end is turned under 1/4 as well. So basically what we're doing is encasing the raw edge of the fabric on the other side. Now, if you were to do a real flat fell seam, it's sort of like an interlocking piece, and you'll have 2 rows of stitching, one that on the outside is on the right or left of the turn of the cloth, and then the other side will be opposite. If that's confusing to you, just grab a pair of jeans and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. After you've pinned through the length, making sure that you're as close to 1/4 inch away from that stitch line with the turn of the cloth, you're going to be taking your iron and pressing this. Now, you can't do that if you've got pins that have a plastic head, so make sure that you're using pins that you can iron on. After you've given it a good press, you'll head over to your sewing machine and you'll be putting the edge foot, or the number 5 foot, on to the machine. So remove whatever foot you have on, put on your edge foot, and then we're going to be moving the needle position over so that it's going to be catching the turn of the cloth. So if I have my stitching on the inside edge, so the right edge, I'm going to be moving my needle position over to the right so that it catches the edge of the fabric. And you can move it just a couple of notches over. I did 3 notches over here. Hold on to your thread tails, start with the back stitch, and then you're going to be sewing down the length of the fabric. Now, in addition to lining up the center of the presser foot for that edge foot with the turn of the cloth, I can also line up the edge of the presser foot, the right edge of the presser foot, with the stitch line, so that not only am I being even in my stitching between the turn of the cloth and the stitch, but also the stitching on the left side and the stitching on the right side. This takes a little bit of practice, but you'll keep working on it and you'll get it. After you've gone to the end of the fabric, you're going to end with a back stitch, and then I want you to check and make sure that there aren't any tucks on the back of your fabric. If you did a good job pressing, you won't see any. You've now completed your faux flat fell seam.